All right, everybody. I think we are ready to go ahead and get started. I want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us. We have a few announcements as everyone gets settled. First, we're recording this session and it's going to be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is also there, and that's where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenters' leads on when to engage with cameras and mics on. We are all set to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to our speakers to start and introduce Matt. Welcome, Matt.
Great. Yeah, hang on as I navigate here. There we go. Okay, so welcome to the post-fire tree mortality special session. What we've tried to do is bring together talks that point the way toward or forward in tree mortality prediction and associated support for land and fire management. And the talks will explore the mechanisms by which fires cause their effects, approaches to predictive modeling, use of remote sensing measurements, and then finally advances in decision support. And want to encourage the speakers and everyone else to join us for the fire circle on Friday. And with that, I'd like to welcome Morgan Varner for his talk.
Sorry, Matt. I'm getting there. Hey, everybody. Well, thanks, Matt. And I'm super excited about this session. We were talking before we got going. We've done this at past conferences, and there's so much new stuff on stress and mortality following fire that I've just really been looking forward to this session for some time. What I'm going to do this morning is talk about tree crown injury, and arguably the most apparent of the post-fire injuries, and go through some of the mechanisms, the patterns, and end on research needs in this area. And I hope that it sets up nicely the next 2 or 3 talks in this special session. We know that crown scorch is important. It's also it is a dominant apparent indicator of injury and of that fire just occurred. We know from the fire and tree mortality database and literally decades of research on tree mortality that crown volume scorched, the proportion of the crown that reveals that injury, is the dominant predictor, and it is often the single predictor for the vast majority of species in North America and globally. In the FTM database, you can see how tightly crown volume scorch is tied to the probability of mortality, and that's based on a really large data set. So it's a great predictor, and so it deserves a lot of attention. It's one of many different ways that fire injures, whether it's the crown, the stem, or below ground, but certainly is a really important one. What I've found, and what the group of us that I'll be talking about in a minute have all kind of come to, is that even though this is such an apparent injury, what do we really know about it? And I think in the literature, it's often overlooked. It's frequently misapplied or poorly defined. And when you start to delve into it, as this group that I'll talk about all got to, you figure out that we don't know very much about it. And so this group discussing this phenomenon that includes these co-authors here at the top, all got together and wrote a paper in New Phytologist early this year. That's open access, and I'd encourage you to look at it. But it goes through what I'm going to talk about today, and that is how heat injures foliage, how trees respond to that injury, how we have measured or perhaps mismeasured that injury, hints at some of the ecological and physiological consequences. And like I mentioned earlier, we'll close with some of the science needs, or at least a version of the needs that we see that we really need to focus on in the future for understanding injury and mortality. So the first question really is, what is scorch? And I will misapply that term just like everyone else has. The injury that the crown reveals or the crown shows is actually pretty diverse. And you see it in the literature that people will use different terms to describe either the same process, or they'll use a single term that they mean to describe 2 or 3 different categories. In this image here from our paper that Bob Van Pelt so masterfully made, it depicts 3 categories of crown injury, and it can be looked at in that categorical way, or can be looked at in the continuous way. And what I'll do here is go a little bit into each of these. In some ways, the way I think about it is from 3 descriptors: senescence, marcescence, and consumption. From the senescence side, that is the fundamental true crown scorch, and that is where the foliage is killed, but the buds are intact. There are a lot of potential mechanisms for injury and mortality, but from any of these 3, crown scorch tends to be the most benign. Lots of species can tolerate 100% of their crown being scorched, and they can tolerate it at a relatively high fire frequency. This tends to be what people focus on, where you see a little green tip or a green bud and foliage that soon senesces, and that tends to be the indicator of crown scorch, that the leaf has been killed, that its connection to the branch is intact, so that the callus can form, the leaf can upsize and fall to the ground, and that is that scorched litter fall that is representative of crown scorch and this senescence. Crown kill is the next most severe, and that is where not only foliage is involved, but also buds and potentially branch cambia, and that tends to cause marcescence. That is, there's something wrong with the branch leaf connection, so that the signaling does not occur to senesce the leaf, and so leaves tend to, when you have crown kill, leaves tend to stay attached to the branches, and you see this apparent injury that lasts for a much longer period. Crown scorch in some species can last as little as 2 or 3 weeks, some species much longer, but crown kill tends to show that or reveal that injury for a long period, because those leaves are marcescent, they stay attached to the tree. And again, those potential mechanisms start to involve branches. And then there's crown consumption that people often report, but not always, causing lots of problems with meta-analyses, et cetera. And that's where the foliage is consumed, suggesting that the heat at that area in the crown was so intense that it ignited the foliage. So, people have talked about different temperature or heating thresholds for these different categories, but we know from crown consumption that it's actually beyond ignition temperatures or beyond that ignition threshold. And so that is where pretty substantial injury occurs to not only foliage, but also branches and potentially the bole that is near that branch. And trying to figure out that heating has been the subject of a lot of recent, really thoughtful work that takes this really diverse heating environment and starts to try to put values, or try to put some understanding of how heat from a fire in its complex, both convective and radiative heat transfer mechanisms, deposits heat on leaves and branches. And what this work has shown, and there'll be a couple talks that touch on this during the session today, is that heat has a really tortuous route through crowns, through branches, through foliage, through individual tree crowns, and also through canopies. There's a really great talk, or a couple talks yesterday in the fire behavior modeling session, that we're talking about the sort of the path of heat through these diverse structures. It's clearly an area we need to invest in, because individual species tend to have vastly different both leaf, branch, and crown architectures. And we know with leaf injury in particular, that from the literature over the last couple decades, there are the mechanisms of injury are pretty diverse. And so this is perhaps a truncated list, but there's evidence that heat damages proteins in leaves, that it certainly damages membranes, enzymes, clearly causes desiccation. There's quite a bit of work that starts now to look at how much heat desiccates foliage. We've observed losses of cuticle integrity, particularly wax melting. That's something that's been looked at from other areas of physiology. Suggestions over guard cell integrity changes, and quite a bit of work over the last decade focusing on embolisms and xylem deformation. Again, these topics will be dealt with in much more detail in subsequent talks. Something that has really been frustrating for those of us who work on post-fire tree mortality is how we measure injury, whether that injury is crown, stem, or below ground. They're all really coarse, and that prevents a lot of our mechanistic growth in these areas. So the typical way that we look at crown scorch is by the proportion of the crown volume that is scorched that shows some measure of injury, whether it regardless of the category, but they're ocular estimates. And so you can imagine a little person here sitting, and those are standing here looking at and making a coarse estimate of a really odd volume. Rarely do crowns fit any perfect volume, and it ignores the void spaces beneath the shell of foliage on the outside of the crown, and it's often open to quite a bit of interpretation. If you've measured crown scorch with other experts that you typically don't work with, you find this out pretty quickly. And indeed, when you start to look at in the fire and tree mortality database for species that have lots of coverage, like ponderosa pine with greater than 38,000 individual observations, you see that it's really easy to ocularly estimate 0% scorch. That one's easy. And it's also really easy to estimate 100% scorch. Those tend to do a nice job, but what we're looking for in these tends to be a logistic relationship or a threshold response. That threshold response is, from a manager standpoint, I don't want to cross that threshold to get to mortality. I want to stay below that. And so looking at thresholds, the values, the individual values, that continuous spectrum is really, really important. When you delve into the individual species, this is something Tim Sherman did last week. We were looking at the FTM database, and what you can see is the whole values of percentage scorch. Here's 20, there's 30, there's 40. I don't have to point out these because you can see them, are much more frequently reported than the midpoint values, 45%, 55%, 65%, et cetera. Clearly that scorch is continuous and it doesn't only occur in 10% pulses, but I think what this suggests is it's a pretty coarse measure using ocular estimates. So there's a push and a talk or two later today about using other techniques to get at the continuous or perhaps the categorical way that we look at crown scorch. This is using ground-based LiDAR in longleaf pine, where you can see the precondition and the post-condition and the change in the returns, as you can observe here in the sapling below. But there are a lot of other remote sensing tools that offer great promise, whether they're multispectral, hyperspectral, or different versions of airborne LiDAR, ground-based LiDAR, or LiDAR that is UAS and can move around individual trees more. Those are exciting because they give us the potential that we can measure something that we know is really important, and we know pretty well that our measurements have been coarse today. The modeling portion is also frustrating. The reality is that species are really different. And so using sort of what have been back of the envelope or rules of thumb fall apart when you move among species. Even in the Southeast, with a small group of pines that are quite related, there's tremendous variation in tree architecture, particularly in the crown, in bud size and bud orientation, and how foliage is oriented. There's great work over the last decade on shielding that occurs in the crowns, and this sort of work really hasn't been looked at in a large way for us to be able to use those data in our models, whether those models are empirical, where we have found ourselves tied to or tethered to, or being able to link those to developments in physical models. What I'm particularly interested in is the broader ecological consequences of scorch or crown injury. This is a relatively typical photo of southeastern pine savannas or woodlands following fire. This is 2.5 weeks after fire in North Florida. And what you see is there's still scorched foliage in the crown and the canopy here in the individual tree crowns, but it's cast a tremendous pulse here of former crown foliage that now ends up as litter. We know really well that scorch is linked to mortality. We know it's linked to reduced growth, but what scorch may mean for nutrient losses or the sort of biogeochemical cycle of nutrients that are so rich in crown foliage and transmitting those to the forest floor, almost completely unknown. What this means from a litter fall dynamic standpoint, again, a disturbance that occurs at such a high frequency, fires in this ecosystem every 2 or 3 years, having that large dump of litter, not only from a biogeochemical standpoint, but from an understory plant recovery, from seedling emergence, et cetera, those questions are really unanswered. And in a lot of cases, they're not even asked. So I think there's a lot of what else in this area that our community should focus on. Beyond that, physiologically, there's been really interesting work on the recovery of photosynthesis, where some studies find that post-scorch, after this senescent period and refoliation occurs, that photosynthesis rates can go up. So a net improvement in photosynthetic rates. Some species we find no difference, in other species we find declines. Whenever that happens in the literature, you know that there's a lot more to learn. And relatedly, we suggest that there's probably retranslocation or resorption of nutrients occurring. This is a short-leaf pine following scorching from a couple of weeks ago, and you can see, and this is a pretty common observation we found in the southern pines, the end of this poorly taken cell phone photo, you can see the end of this leaf here is brown, and then it reaches a green point. A couple of years ago, Kevin Hires and I marked individual leaves with Sharpies and tracked the change in this green line as it moved back toward the branch, suggesting that that green that we know is nitrogen rich, phosphorus, potassium, et cetera, is likely suggesting that there's retranslocation occurring, which could be really important, both from a back of the envelope, if you know how many nutrients are in the crowns, to really how they're capitalizing on their ability to take back nutrients for refoliation or for other processes. Those questions are unasked and certainly could be really important. We close that paper with a long table of science needs, and I won't bore you now, but there are a lot of them, and I think I'd encourage all of us to think much more about this phase, this sort of precursor to mortality that is crown injury, and thinking about ways that we dig into to better understand it. And with that, I'll close.
Great. Thanks a lot, Morgan. That's really interesting stuff, and glad you all thought deeply about it. There are no questions that I can see right now. Just quickly ask one. So in your view, are buds generally more vulnerable than the branches to which they're attached in terms of, being killed in a fire? And does that answer kind of depend on species?
Yeah, it's the bud portion. Longleaf pine's a good example because people always will say something about the leaf architecture that surrounds a bud and how it's protecting it. And it also has a really large bud. And in comparison to the other the co-occurring southern pines, that bud diameter, bud size, and its general resistance to heat injury is pretty wide. So I think that's a really exciting area. People are starting to look at buds more. They clearly have looked at it for a long time, but I think getting to that, not only is foliage killed, but buds are injured or buds are killed, is a really exciting frontier.
Yep. Okay. Right. So anyone who's got a question, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask if you'd like. And just to note here, we're at 9:20, so I think we need to probably move on unless there's a quick question.
Catch us in the fire circle. Thanks.
Thanks, Morgan.
Matt, do you want to transition to your slides? And so Andreas Barr, who's on the originally was scheduled to give his talk, unfortunately is not able to, and so Matt Dickinson has kindly stepped in and is going to give a talk in the same time slot instead of Andreas. So take it away, Matt.
Great, thanks, Sharon. So I'll just upfront say the data from this talk are entirely from the RX Cadre project, and so I want to acknowledge that project, the people involved with it, and some others who were involved in collecting getting the data and doing the analysis. So the situation we have, this is kind of what I'm pushing here, is that infrared radiation is the only way we have currently to characterize fires, active fires, across space and time at high resolution. It's the only way we've got practically. It's not that there may not be other ways in the future, but right now this is what we've got. And so the challenge is to develop these IR measurements so they're quantitative and so they better describe fire energy generation and its dissipation, and then use those measurements to predict ecological effects. And if we can do that, I see a wide range of applications, both for in science, to develop the science, and also support management, both in prescribed and wildfire contexts. So in this talk, I just want to note that there's a continuum of approaches for predicting ecological effects of fires, all the way from statistical bivariate relationships on one end to process models that sort of explicitly include the mechanisms that are causing effects. And I'll start with a dose response approach, which is closer to the bivariate sort of statistical end, and then add some process and hopefully increase generality. Chad Hoffmann's talk later will move us farther along the process continuum, and other talks like Morgan's and the ones that are going to follow this one will provide a deeper understanding of mechanisms, which is really crucial. So dose response approach was developed in toxicology, and I want to acknowledge Bob Kremens here, because I think he probably was having a master's in toxicology as well as being an instrument physicist, brought this concept into fire ecology. That's what I think that's true. So anyway, fire, in our case, fire heat is a dose, and excuse me, the effect is a response. So, and as I mentioned, in this generality is like by necessity limited, because it's limited to your data set and the situations that in which this data were collected. So, can we add process so that it kind of intervenes between the dose and the response? Because in fact, the black box is large. And so just starting off with a potential example here, and really simplifying down from what Morgan talked about. So a classic example is Van Wagner's crown scorch relationship. So on the left of the equation there, you have scorch height, and then the dose is the fire line intensity here, and the sort of the processes involved are kind of encapsulated in the 2/3 power of intensity and this temperature rise to some lethal limit. And that could be, cell necrosis, or it could be related to, the embolism, wax melting. Like, we don't really know, but as Morgan was discussing. But anyway, so there's some process in this equation, and this helps us. This is sort of a translator between the dose, which is power line intensity, and the response, which is torque. And hopefully, because it incorporates our behavior, it incorporates ambient conditions, sort of the ambient temperature, and its rise to some lethal limit, that it'll be a much more general way to predict this effect that we're interested in, that is scored. So, and what's left in the black box, in a way, is this proportionality constant here, like which encapsulates a lot of other things that are not in this equation explicitly. Okay, so I am now moving to the topic of the talk. I'm going to look at modeled hardwood stem injury and inferred from remotely sensed infrared. So we start with measurements of fire radiated energy from airborne infrared data. Here's an example down at the bottom left of fire radiated power, and sequential images then that you integrate through time give you an energy value for each pixel. The dose is energy deposition on stems, and then the processes involved are heat transfer through the stem and tissue necrosis to get to top on the right. Okay, so as I mentioned, data from RX Cadre, specifically Eglin Air Force Base, which is RX Cadre was a coordinated measurements project, and there's a good slew of papers coming. Even still now, some are still coming out based on the data. Just acknowledging the Joint Fire Science Program. And I've just obscured the vegetation we looked at. So there's longleaf pine savanna, which I'll just call forested, and there's non-forested, grassy, herbaceous, shrubby ranges, as they call them. So forested and non-forested is what you'll be seeing. So on the left is forested and some instruments. On the right is non-forested. And the focus here will be on top kill of turkey oak. And right here is a small multi-stem clump. And then in the forested site, they're larger single stem individuals that are important. So the kind of the this chain of steps here is, we'll start with remote sense energy. I'll talk about that, both airborne and on towers. We'll look at energy deposition on sensors and fires. Then the heat transfer process and cambial necrosis, so killing live tissue down to the vascular cambium, and then to get to a hardwood top kill prediction. Airborne data, this is what it looks like. Here's it's sequential measurements of fire radiated power, kilowatts per square meter. It's you want to get to quantitative, you have to. And it's for our purposes, it was on a 3 to 5 minute time step. These are not from RX Cadre, these are from an oak system, but so you got a baseline established, and then ignition proceeding after that. This is helicopter incendiary, sort of spherical and ignition device, sort of dropping ping pong balls, essentially, which is all I can think about right now. Moving on all the way through to where you start getting burnout of all the available fuels. So that's what the IR data set sort of looks like. And that it's time integrated, or that fire rated power is time integrated to give you energy, which is in here units of kilojoules per square meters or megajoules per square meter. And so just up front, it's gappy, the data set. a lot of these fuels are flashy. A 3 to 5 minute time step does not capture enough of the energy. So where it does, we get good info on fire rated energy. Where it doesn't, it's less high quality. So Carini, Clawberg, Andy Hudak, and Ben Bright and others, they produce continuous maps through interpolation to provide the data that you'll see today. Then there's a single pixel instrument on a tower. It's a radiometer. Again, measures fire radiated power, which rises quickly as the fire enters the pixel, and then the power declines slowly as the pixel cools and smoldering combustion kind of ceases. And then you time integrate that to get a fire rated energy value. Same as with the aircraft. So now, okay, so talked about the radiation measurements. Now we're going to look at energy deposition on sensors. Fire behavior package developed in the Missoula Fire Lab, particularly with Brett Butler's project. And so this is a dual sensor. There's, as you can see in the inset here, there's a radiation sensor and a total deposited flux sensor that measures both radiative and convective in combination. And again, we time integrate that to deposited energy. And here's just a photo of, on the bottom right, of a fire behavior package in a fire at RX Cadre. So here are the data. On the left is airborne, on the right is radiometer, fire rated energy on the x-axis, and then deposited energy on the y-axis. So, there's a generally good relationship between fire rated energy measurements and energy deposition. As you would expect, note that the forested blocks, there's more energy being produced in them than there is in the grassy herbaceous shrubby sites. There's some points have kind of fallen off here, and these are low intensity fires where the flame heights were lower than the fire behavior package sent this sensor. So that's a known issue here. And a key assumption is that I'm making is that energy deposition on these sensors is the same as it is in stems. I think approximately that's probably the case, but there are some interesting problems. It's a super interesting and complicated physics and engineering issue that needs work. Okay, so that's energy deposition. Now, how do we model heat transfer into tree stems? And I've taken a fairly simple approach here because it seems to work. That these are data from multiple tree species in the they're in the hardwoods, central hardwoods of the U.S. And what you have here is the depth to which you're getting kill, like tissue kill within the stem. We'll call necrosis depth versus deposited energy measured. These are all lab experiments. And so this dashed line fits the modeled values. The solid line here fits the data. So the model and the data are pretty close. The model here is FireStem 2D, which is an update of FireStem, which was sort of born out of the Missoula Fire Lab, and particularly that Brett Butler's lab. And again, an assumption here is that the stem is getting the same amount of heat as the sensor. To be clear, we're going to use this part of the distribution, and because these stems we're interested in are fairly low diameter, and our fires are fairly low intensity and resulting in fairly low amounts of deposited energy. Just quickly on the top right here, you see necrosis depth. So this is a staining procedure that works really awesome on hardwoods. And you can see how deeply the tissue is killed after an exposure. This stem is toast, a red maple. You can see the bark is, the kill depth, the necrosis depth is way deeper than the bark depth. So you're going to see that stem is dead. Okay, so the other key piece of information you need here is you need to know the diameter versus thickness relationship. And let's just say here for a 1 millimeter, 1 centimeter stem, if you killed the tissue down to that depth in the fire, you know, stems less than, you know, 2.5 centimeters diameter would get killed, and the others would probably escape. All right, so talked about the radiation, deposition, you know, the approach to cambium necrosis, and now to the top kill prediction. So here's what we got. These are the forested sites, the gray bars, estimated from radiometer, and then airborne WASP. That's the name of the sensor system. So top kill diameter is higher on these forested sites than it is on the non-forested sites, and because there's more fuel and there's more energy. Fairly simplistic, but there's also a lot of variability across those fires, reflecting variability in fuels and fire behavior. So you know, what I've done is sort of add to the dose response, sort of add some process to this dose response concept and approach. There's a lot of interesting stuff to do here, and I'll just mention one thing that's interesting and that we've sort of advanced, we've made since this last paper. So, and this is to measure convective or what we're also called sensible heat flux and energy. And why this is important is that the sensible energy is the biggest part of the fire heat budget by far. It's in these flame fronts, it's like 65% of the energy dissipated from the combustion process, whereas radiation that we're actually measuring in at high spatial temporal resolution is about 20%. So it's super critical to understand variation in this radiation fraction to know about sensible energy. And so we've advanced that measurement. A lot more needs to be done on it. Here's an energy, a heat budget, so that balances the heat generation, the source term, with all this dissipation, going from ignition sink, soil heating, deposition of vegetation, latent heat, radiation, and sensible heat flux, all in order of their increasing contribution. So we'll just stop right there, and thanks for listening.
Well, we have a couple minutes. If anyone has questions for Matt, you can just either type them in the chat, or Q&A, or unmute yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think we have any questions right now, Matt. But I have one. So you talked about the great the fire radiative energy. You're actually measuring radiation, and then you can also use those measurements to estimate sensible energy from convection. What are your thoughts on how we can move to capture smoldering energy released from smoldering?
Yeah, that's a really hard problem. I think some people, you know, are thinking that you can capture it in the radiation measurement. I'm really skeptical about it, because it's then also you're with these pixels you're measuring, it's a super mixed thermal regime. So you've got smoldering going on, you've got cooling, fuel particles and soil, you've got a little flaming maybe going on at the same time that's lingering. So it's very difficult to parse out what's smoldering and what's not. I think maybe that becomes easier if you've got a deep duct situation where clearly the energy generation after 10 or 20 minutes or whatever is probably mostly smoldering. So it's possible in some systems probably, but it would be great to have it, those measurements verified with some ground, actual measurements directly at smoldering.
Well, thank you, Matt, and it's 9:40, so we can move on or to Dan Johnson. Dan, if you want to get your slides up, and I'll turn back over to moderating to Matt.
Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, thanks. Okay. And let's see if I can get this to. Okay, does that look okay? Okay, well, first of all, I just wanted to say thanks to the organizers for this. This is a really exciting session, and I'm super stoked to be here. I wish we were in Florida, but you know, this is almost good. So these data that I'm going to present were actually part of Raquel Partelli-Filtrin's PhD dissertation. And so I think her name should certainly go first. But there were other people that were directly involved with this. Alex Thompson did a lot of the carbon measurements, and then Henry Adams and Alistair Smith were involved in the mentorship or helping direct the research. So today I'm going to talk about the effects of fire on tree water transport, but also tree carbon processes. And just to give credit where credit is due, a lot of folks have been interested, or a lot of folks have been involved in this. Crystal Colden, Alan, Darko, Kara, Catherine, Megan, Luke, and Aaron. And then some of the funding for this was from JFSP and some from NSF. So I just want to give a shout out to all those folks before I get started. So this talk is really going to focus on younger conifer life stages. And, you know, for me, the reason that I'm interested in young conifer life stages is because it's really the least well understood life stage of trees. And with increasing fires, disturbance events, you know, throughout the world, this is going to result in a shift to younger age classes in our forests. And so I think these are life stages that we need to get a better understanding of. Not only that, these are also necessary, you know, seedlings and saplings are necessary for reforestation, for sustaining populations. And in a lot of places out west, we've seen natural regeneration failure over the last 25 years. And, you know, there've been some good papers out of Phil Higuera's group at Montana and others showing that places where ponderosa and Doug fir should be regenerating, they're just not. And we've also seen plantings fail in the forest industry out west. So I think this young conifer life stage is really critical to get a better understanding of. And then talking with some of the folks at Weyerhaeuser, they're saying that they can't grow enough seedlings or saplings for replanting. Same goes with the folks at the Forest Service. So, you know, combine all that natural regeneration failure with not enough seedlings to plant after fires or cutting. And, you know, we have a big hole in our knowledge, but also in our sort of production, I guess, of seedlings. So, you know, initially, I guess 10 years ago, I thought of fire as too stochastic to study as an ecophysiologist. And, you know, I was perfectly comfortable with drought because it's pretty easy to apply a certain level of stress to drought. Same with light, same with heat, same with cold. You know, we're also okay with biotic stressors like herbivory. But to me, you know, fire was just really, really random, right? From like, you know, one foot or 1 meter to the next. And so it really wasn't until I got to Idaho and we started talking about doing some of these lab burns where we could control the amount of energy that it started, for me personally, I felt like that would be a place where I would be comfortable working. And so before I get into these data, I want to talk about the ways that fire might impact a tree. And so here's my crude tree compared to Morgan's beautiful tree. But it should serve its purpose anyway. So, we know that fire can consume foliage, it can damage foliage, it can potentially heat soil and damage roots, or maybe mycorrhizae, or other microbes underground. We know that it can kill bugs. We know that it potentially can damage cambia. But if we look at the cross section of this tree, which is this brown and orange thing, you see that on the outside we have bark. To the inside of the bark we have the phloem for transporting carbon and other nutrients from the canopy down to the roots and other parts of the plant. And inside that layer, we have this green layer, which is the vascular cambium. So that's the actively dividing cells that produce phloem to the outside and xylem to the inside. And then here in the very center, we have this huge mass of xylem, which is mostly filled with water. And so when we think about a fire coming through this tree, we can think about, it's got to go through the bark, and then it's got to go through the phloem, and then it's got to go through the cambium before it gets to the xylem. And so that leads us to a couple of hypotheses. So first of all, sort of a research question that drove all this was, how does fire kill ponderosa pine saplings? We couldn't burn huge old trees, and we also thought, well, we have some good reasoning for burning saplings. So that was our working question. And then our hypotheses were, one, neither lethal fire nor non-lethal fire will result in catastrophic embolism, which is a little bit counter to some of the other observations and hypotheses out there. But, based on the fact that even in a sapling, you have to go through, you got to go through a little bit of bark, and then you have to go through phloem, and then you have to go through cambium before you can get to the xylem in terms of the cross-sectional area of the stem. And then our second hypothesis was lethal fire will impair carbon transport to roots. And that's just another way of saying that these seedlings we think will experience phloem damage. So the methods behind what we did in these experiments was, we had ponderosa pine. The hydraulics experiments, they were about 2 years old. In the carbon experiments, they were about 3 years old. They were all well watered. There's no drought in these studies, although Ecology did publish a drought study that also either came out late 2020 or early 21. Here, the burn conditions, we used a non-lethal fire dose of 0.7 megajoules per meter squared for the hydraulics. But then in the carbon studies, we used a lethal dose of 1.5 megajoules per meter squared. And then in the hydraulics experiment, we measured hydraulic conductivity and also vulnerability to embolism right after the fire, and then also 21 months post-fire. And then Ecology also did some amazing anatomy work, xylem anatomy work using microscopy. Okay, so here's just a picture of the burn lab setup with the fuel and the ponderosa pine in the middle. So what did we find? Well, let's see. So here on the left, I have 1 day post-fire, which refers to the upper panels, and then I have 21 months post-fire, which refers to the lower panels. So here on the left-hand side, we have native PLC, percent loss of conductivity. That means how much embolism was there in the stem of these plants. And here we have unburned in the blue, and we have burned in the yellow. And then we have those 1 day post-fire and 21 months post-fire. And they're not different. So the fire was not causing any embolism in the xylem. But, so here on the right-hand side, we have percent loss of conductivity. And then on the x-axis, we have the xylem tension or water potential, whichever you want to call it. And so as you go from left to right, you get drier and drier. And we see in 1 day post-fire, burn and unburned saplings are not different, not at all. So it doesn't make them more vulnerable to embolism right after they're burned. But 21 months after they're burned, there's a big difference in these two curves. And I will go into detail about that. So they're more vulnerable to embolism once they've been burned and then they have grown for a while. So if we look at the stem, here in the middle, that's the first 2 years of growth. And then it was burned, and then we let it grow for another 2 years. And you can see where the original fire scars were. Now, if we look at that as a slice, you know, as a hand section under the microscope with stain, here we have a little bit of a different view. And if we look at where these arrows are, which is where the cambium was damaged or killed, and the tree is growing to close up those old wounds, and it produces these very weird traumatic xylem elements. So on the right here in C, you can see this is normal xylem, and that's from the previous 2 years of growth. And then here we have the traumatic xylem. And then again, you can see it in D as well. In the upper portion, we have the old normal xylem, and in the bottom, we have this traumatic xylem. And then also, if we look at xylem staining, here we have a control, and here we have a burned. And you can see that where that fire scar is, a lot of that xylem has just been shut off. It's just been blocked from being conducted. So what we think we're seeing here is that, you know, fire didn't cause embolism. It didn't make xylem more vulnerable to embolism, but the wood that was made after the fire was less resistant than the pre-fire or the unburned seedlings. And so we think this might be due to the production of this traumatic xylem, which is probably not super great at transporting water. It looks like its main function is probably just to seal off that wound. Okay, so now onto the carbon side of things. So we measured starch, we measured sugar, total non-structural carbohydrates, is what NSC stands for. And we did this the day before the burn, 7 days, 14 days, and 28 days after the burn. And we measured carbohydrates in needles, stems, and roots. And so I have these broken down as starch and sugar, but today I'm just showing the total non-structural carbohydrates, so which is everything put together. So we have three treatments here. We have unburned in blue, burned in orange, and then defoliated in pink. And the reason we defoliated was we wanted to have sort of a control, like if all the fire did was remove the foliage, what would happen? And it didn't damage anything else. So that's sort of a control to test for those sorts of effects. And if we look here at the leaf, there's no pink in the leaf because they've been removed. There's no significant difference between burned and unburned, although it does look like burned maybe a little bit lower. But then if we move down to the stem, you can see that, pull it up my own screen so I can see what I'm talking about. If we look at the stem, you can see that in the burn stems, the total non-structural carbohydrates are much lower, and then the same in the roots. Now, if we just look at whole plant structural carbohydrates in burned and unburned, you can see, yeah, they're much lower in the whole plants. And if we look at stem plus roots, you can see they're dramatically lower than unburned or defoliated. Now, if we look at the plants themselves, so here we have some cross sections of unburned saplings, and you can see the tissue is all still really nice and green, and the cambium, you know, this layer here looks healthy. Then if we look at these up here, these have been burned, and you can see by 6 days after the burn, it's really dark, really brown, and that's a dead cambium most likely, and a dead phloem. So what we think is happening with carbon in these saplings is that there's phloem damage or phloem mortality. There's probably also cambium mortality, and this leaves the roots and the stems depleted of carbon. These plants just aren't able to move to translocate the carbon that's in the needles or the upper canopy back down into the stem and to the roots. And so in ponderosa pine saplings, the mechanism of mortality due to fire is probably not hydraulic failure. We didn't detect any embolism after we burned these things. It's most likely from cambium and phloem death. Now, one of the interesting things I think that came out of this, and I wish Andreas was here because he could speak to this as well, is that these injuries from fire, these old fire scars that, where this traumatic xylem is being produced, may make these trees more susceptible to drought-induced mortality. And I think that's probably the most interesting thing to come out of this. If they're producing that xylem that is traumatic and it's not very good at transporting water and it's not very resistant to embolism, then that could mean a tree that, several years on down the road is going to be more susceptible to a drought-induced mortality. And Akel actually showed the inverse as well. Droughted ponderosa pine saplings are really, really susceptible to fire-induced mortality, even at low fire-rated energies. But I have to throw out a couple of caveats here because these were not big plants. So this could be very different in other species. It could be very different from other life stages. And I think, all of us that have, seen burns in the field or have worked on lab burns in burn labs know they're different beasts. So a real fire in the outside is very different from a lab burn. And so although I think these data are really cool, and I think that we're making some progress, I think we also need to sort of take some lab burn data with a grain of salt. And with that, I'll just answer any questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dan. That's really nice work. I don't see any questions right now. I'll just encourage people to speak up and ask a question. In the interim, I'll just ask this. So I'm really happy to see you reject the hypothesis that the vapor pressure deficit stress that it wasn't propagating through the foliage into the stems to cause embolism. That's the hypothesis that Katie Kavanaugh and I sort of proposed, and glad to see that rejected for this system. But yeah, any comments about that? And are there different species or taxa that sort of that signal, will get transferred into the wood?
So I went into this, that your and Katie's hypothesis was my working hypothesis going into this. But pines tend to be extremely hydraulically segmented between branches and leaves, with leaves that are very favorable to cavitation and branches that aren't. And so I think that, in a lot of pines, that might be the way things work. But, Bill Hoffmann's going to probably show some data on magnolia a little later today. And I think it could be a very, very different story for the plants that he has worked on. So I think it may be taxa specific.
Nice. Any questions? We've got a minute or two.
Okay, this is Alina Kanzler, and I tried to drop one in the question and answer, but I know these show up in a number of different question and answer spots. You mentioned that injuries from fire could make them more susceptible to drought, but what about pre-fire drought stress on xylem conductivity? Is there then a connection to the impacts on cambium and phloem injury and repair capacity?
Yeah, so Akel's study on saplings that were under drought stress, they showed that those saplings were super vulnerable to fire-induced mortality, even at low fire intensities. And I think some of that is there's a tissue, between the phloem and the bark that is the cortex. And I think the cortex shrinks and provides much less insulation when trees are droughted. And so I think that's what's going on with that. And I think that means that trees that are, under a drought are more likely to have phloem and cambial damage than trees that aren't, given the same fire intensity.
There's one more real quick one from Gabrielle. What kind of containers were the saplings planted in?
They were in what are they called? Tree. They're the leach tree pots. They're big, deep pots, and the pot sat under board with that burned over. So hope that if you want to send me an email, I can send you a link to them.
Yeah, great. Sama, thanks for that. I'm not seeing the questions on HOVA. I think I'm seeing them on Zoom. So with that, thank you, Dan. That was really interesting. Next up is Bill Hoffmann. And Bill, if you could, or Dan, if you could stop sharing, and Bill, if you could.
Hey, hello, everyone. This is a great session so far, and previous talks have done a great job of setting up my topic here. And this work is, let me know if I'm breaking up, because I think my internet might be a little slow. I can turn off my video if that's the case. But so this is work that grew out of some initial work by Amanda Rodriguez and Lorenzo Rossi, previous members in my lab. And then, they had some really intriguing initial results. And then when COVID came along and prevented me from going to Brazil for my field season, I decided to look at this in greater detail. And so, so the Heat-Plume hypothesis, I would describe it as stating that the warm air occurring during combustion, during fire, causes such a rapid heating of the foliage and the air surrounding the foliage, resulting in very rapid water loss, resulting in acute water deficit within the plant, which could potentially cause enough a lowering of water potential to an extent that this cavitation of the xylem were to occur. And potentially, if this were severe enough, could cause death of the tree or portion of the tree. Now, the physics behind this is pretty straightforward. We know that the evaporative demand, for evaporation of water from the interior of leaves is very, very sharply related to water, or the evaporative demand, depending on exactly how your starting point is. Your evaporative demand should go up about 100-fold from a starting point of a leaf at 30 degrees Celsius up to 100 degrees Celsius. And then once the leaf reaches 100 degrees Celsius, the evaporation from that leaf is determined not by leaf temperature, but by the radiation load and heat load from convection from the surrounding air. So, so this would continue to go up, but whereas leaf temperature may not. So there's, the physics is clear, pretty straightforward. You can get massive demand for to drive a lot of water if the conditions are sufficient to supply that water to the leaves. But there are a lot of uncertainties as to what's actually going on inside the plant during fire. Morgan set this up nicely, indicating there's a lot of things that are going on that just adds complexity to know whether or not actually enough water deficit might be occurring, say, in the trunk of the plant to really cause a problem. And so there's this phenomena in plant hydraulics called hydraulic segmentation, which normally is attributed to leaves, whereby leaves are more vulnerable to cavitation. And therefore, when the plant is exposed to water deficit, these will embolize first, sacrificing the leaves, protecting the rest of the stem from those acute water deficits. And not only may leaves be more vulnerable to embolism, more likely to form these embolisms, these blockages, these air bubbles that form within the xylem and block the transport of water. Not only may the leaves be more vulnerable, but just the physics of water loss and water transport through the plant means that the water potential in the leaves is going to be more negative. The water deficit is going to be more acute, closer to the point of water loss. And so that as well will result in, should cause a tendency for more embolism to occur in more distal portions of the water transport chain. So even if the segmentation, the blockages don't occur in the leaves, they may be occurring in these terminal branches. If that blockage is sufficient because of embolism, it essentially seal off that distal portion, protecting the stem, the trunk from these acute water deficits. So that's one issue. We don't really know how this embolism might be distributed through the plant if it does occur. And yeah, so if it, this hydraulic segmentation may block this water loss. There's other complexities that when much of the resistance of water flow in the leaves themselves is through this outside xylem, the living cells surrounding the vascular bundles, where this water is passing often through cell membranes from leaf to leaf. But once these cell membranes are broken down, if a lethal temperature is reached, that will clear the path for more ready water transport. So, xylem blockages may slow water transport. This sort of breakdown of membranes in the leaves may accelerate water transport. And then, there are issues of what happens to the cuticle and to the stomata during burning, which may shut down water transport or may make water transport more effective, so resulting in more water loss. And then finally, what's happening when the leaf combusts? And this is worthwhile because experimental and modeling examinations of this heat plume hypothesis have largely been restricted to conditions of non-flaming conditions where the leaves are exposed to very hot, dry air. But all this complexity, what's going on within the leaves, within the branches during actual burning, complicates the whole situation. So, if we now sort of summarize these issues, so if we go from conditions of low severity, sublethal heating of foliage to scorching of foliage to actual combustion of foliage, and we would expect the physical force driving the loss of water to increase, resulting, if that were the only factor working, would result in an increase of water loss and water supply to the leaves and more water deficit in the trunk of the plant. Similarly, damage to this cuticle and stomata along the same severity, range of severity would probably result in more water loss under more severe burn conditions. However, embolism, if that is occurring, wherever it is occurring, would tend to slow the water loss, reduce the amount of water transport through the rest of the plant. And then just the utter destruction of leaf and xylem. There's so much going on. Water's boiling in the tissues. The transport path is just utterly destroyed. We don't really know how, what direction that effect might have. Anyway, so what is the net effect of all of this? We don't really know. We didn't really know. And so before doing this work, we really didn't have any expectations as to whether this could even occur if you could still have a lot of water loss occurring when combustion occurs. And then there had been some suggestions in the literature that once scorching is achieved in the leaves, that there may be essentially no more water transport through the plant, because that essentially is acting to shut down, sealing off the rest of the plant from water loss. Okay, so the questions, so can these high levels of water loss be sustained during fire? Does this transport of water to the foliage, should say, increase or decrease with fire severity? And do the answers to 1 and 2, are they generalizable across species? Does heat damage to the leaves result in uncontrolled water loss after burning due to the damage to the cuticle and so on? And then finally, is all of this water loss that's occurring, is it sufficient to likely cause substantial water deficit to the main plant itself, far away from the actual combustion? So, so this is our setup. So this is a very simple setup. We use stems of Magnolia grandiflora. We have this bunt pan where we could put measured amounts of gasoline as a fuel. We're measuring temperatures with thermocouples, and then the water uptake was determined on a second-by-second basis by, there's a receptacle of water, and this is on a balance connected to a data logger. So as burning occurred, we knew exactly how much water was being taken up by the branch. And so this is what a high severity burn looked like. Whoops. The bird enjoying COVID. So here we're starting. This shows a synchronized graph of water uptake during the burn. And so let's see what's happening here. So it's starting to increase. Wait for it. So notice how pretty late in the burning, we're seeing a really sharp increase in the amount of water taken up from this receptacle in the balance. So, to some extent, this may be a lag in the time required for this sort of water uptake to be transmitted down the sample, but it does certainly suggest that high rates can continue during the combustion process itself. And then it gradually drops off, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. So here's so that was a high severity burn using that largest amount of gasoline, 50 milliliters. But overall, we find that that there is in fact an increasing relationship between the severity of the fire and the total amount of water taken up. And just so you can sort of get a feel for what these different levels of severity actually correspond to, these are some representative photos after burning. This is one at the lowest level of fuel. You had most of the leaves killed. Some of the upper ones been sort of shielded from the effects of the fire. You have varying ranges of damage to plants. And then at these higher two levels, you have complete combustion of the leaves. So that previous graph showed the total water taken up during combustion. This shows the peak water uptake at the peak of highest rate of water uptake. Probably more useful is this graph on the right, which rescales it relative to the rate of water uptake before combustion started. And for these higher levels of severity, the average was that the peak water uptake was 29-fold higher during the burn than prior to the burn. So in order to get this much water moving through the sample, means you have to have a really sharp gradient of water potential, meaning that the water potential of the leaves is substantially reduced. And I see them on time, but we estimate the water burn water potentials and so on, which suggest that these water potentials in the leaves during burning were actually quite low. Now, what this actually means is an open question, because these really correspond to the point in time in which the leaves were actually combusting. So this is maybe more of an academic calculation, but it does point out that very low water potentials can be achieved as a result of burning within the plant, at least near the site of burning. Now, these are much lower water potentials than the water potentials at which either the petiole or the branch would be substantially embolized. So these are quite low values. Does water continue to be lost from sort of lightly sampled or even severely sampled branches, foliage after burning? We did see a ongoing loss of water from these samples that continued for even hours. This is the time at which burning occurred. This is just one representative sample. And at this point here, we cut the branch off. So this is just the residual water loss, evaporation from the receptacle itself. So this long tail of continued water loss, at first we thought was ongoing water loss, but we later did experiments in the lab which indicated that this is in fact just rehydration of desiccated tissues. Now, we found that this is very generalizable across a range of 8 species that we looked at. And this is one point which I, even though I'm running short of time, I really think it's worth making. These more recent data on this range of species collected by a graduate student of mine, Talis Donnelly, found that if you rescale the total water loss as a function of how much water is in a fully hydrated leaf to begin with, we find that the water loss is really quite low. Only the equivalent of 8% of what's in the leaf is being taken up over the course of burning. Of course, most of the water that's in the leaf is evaporating off or boiling off or evaporating off during burning. So particularly at the higher intensities. So if 100% of the water from the foliage is lost during burning, but only 8% of that is actually being taken up at this end, suggests that there is a lot of blockages going on in these distal branches, and calls into question whether this amount of water taken up really is enough to impose a substantial water deficit further down the tree. And now we may be underestimating this. There is reason to believe that longer duration burns may have more, result in even more water loss, but I'll skip over that. So conclusions: can high levels of water loss be sustained during fire? Yes. Does water transport to foliage increase or decrease with fire severity? It increases. Does this happen across species? Yes. Does heat damage to the leaves result in uncontrolled post-fire water loss? Didn't see any evidence of this. And is the amount of water loss sufficient to cause a substantial plant water deficit? Maybe, but the more I think about it, the more I think that it requires probably very special circumstances for this to matter to the main stem of the tree. Well, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Bill. That's really interesting stuff. I love the bunt pan as well, and your whole setup. Unfortunately, I don't see any questions in the Whova chat. I did manage to access that, and we're out of time. So I think we will move on to Giovanna Battipaglia. And Giovanna, or Bill, if you could stop sharing your screen, and then Giovanna, if you could share yours. Thank you very much, Bill.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me well? Perfect, okay. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I would love to be really there directly with you, but I am on the other side of Europe. And actually today is really cold, strange for Naples. So let's talk about fire. First, what I wanted to discuss with you, a multidisciplinary approach that we are using to understand better. Oh, sorry, I did not. Okay. Now it's fine. To better understand the post-fire ecophysiological processes of plants. And why we decide to apply a multidisciplinary approach, actually because, of course, nowadays forests are experiencing a lot of trigger due to the climate change and to do the different natural and anthropogenic factor disturbing the forest growth and inducing forest mortality. So in order to disentangle it, to better understand how the different factors really affect the forest, we need different tools that has different temporal and spatial resolution. So what I would propose here, it's to couple together the classical dendroisotope approach with the other technique that actually we have seen today, how they work quite well, like the cavitation study, the xylogenesis, and also a digital monitoring that give us the possibility to follow in continuous what is going on to the trees. Our study site is the Vesuvio National Park. Maybe you heard about it because it's the famous volcano that destroyed Pompeii several years ago, but it's also a very beautiful forest. And in 2017, it was completely burned. It was a huge wildfire that burned the majority of the area and actually killed several trees. As soon as after the fire, since this is our experimental lab since many years right now, we went there and we could recognize different area with different severity of fire. Number one indicated an area where the trees were completely killed, or at least the 80% of the crown was injured, and there was a strong there was also a strong problem on the trunks. Then we found the number 2 and number 3 area more located on the other slope that are characterized by a low and medium severity fire. Actually, the low severity fire was possible thanks to prescribed fire that we applied a year before the big wildfire happens. And we choose also an area like a control, because in this part the trees were not burned, so we could use them like a control for our study. First we applied, so we were there, we sampled the trees, 15 per each site, and we applied the classical dendrochronological approach. This is just to bring you in our lab. And what we found, of course, that the site experienced also in the past other fire event. So this this is the chronology with the tree ringweed index. And there was a huge fire in 93. And also, of course, another peak of negative growth that we found out there was also other fire. If we focus our attention on 2017, so when the wildfire occurred, we found a decrease in tree ringweed actually in all the sites, even in the control one. Why happens that? Because that year, the 2017, and here I show you the climatic data, it was a particular year with very high temperature and very low precipitation. So the stress, the drought stress was also already affecting the trees, and this means that they grow less, at least in the radial growth. Then we wanted to see if there was a consistent relationship between the reduction of crown and the tree ringweeds, so directly the radial growth. And if you have a look to the high severity site where we found a reduction up to 80%, there is a huge negative correlation between the crown reduction and tree ringweed. So the tree is showing a high crown reduction, they grow less. This is not true when we have a very small crown reduction, like in the medium or in the low severity site, up to the 10%, nothing really happens. Then we decide, okay, let's have a look more to the physiology of the plants. Let's try to understand if this crown reduction can make difference in the photosynthetic activity or in the stomatal conductance. And so we analyze in our lab, the Kona lab, the carbon and the oxygen isotope, and those are the chronology. Of course, you found all the details because this is the first part of my data has been already published in Frontiers in Plant Science. But what I wanted to point out here with you is that in 2017, so the year of the fire, we found an increase at the height and the medium severity site in the delta 13C compared to the control, while there was an increase in the delta 018, especially in the height severity site, but basically in all of them. And if we consider the delta 018, since there was no difference in the water source, we know the geology of the place and the hydrology of the place, so we could, and of course we even trace the water source of the plants, we can say that maybe they had this was more related to the fact that the plants experience a decrease in the stomatal conductance, especially when there is a strong crown reduction. Until then, the situation was changing a bit. Up to now, the high severity fire trees, they die completely, while they are still surviving the tree in all the other site, in the medium, in the low severity fire, and of course in the control. And we decide to follow better and to see how the fire could change the wood formation. And so we applied the xylogenesis approach. The xylogenesis is basically the collection of small fire core, you can see here, every 15 days, in order to count the cell and see what is going on, timing then their formation. So here you see the cambial cell in the two groups, because then we grouped the trees in the Barnett and the control one. So the Barnett experience also a very high crown reduction, up to now is more than 50%, while of course the control, they are not defoliated, they still, they have never been hit by fire. You see that in all the different phases of the wood formation, so from the cambial, the post-cambial, the cell with development and lignification of secondary walls, up to the mature cell, there is, first of all, what we could observe, that in those areas, the cambial activity never stopped. This not really surprised us, because also the colleague from the other part of the Mediterranean are observing that basically we have a very long growing season. Since the temperatures are quite good, they are quite high even in winter time, the cambial activity never stopped. We only found a very small stop of about 3 weeks in January of the next year. So first of all, no stop in the cambial activity, but also a very good timing between the formation of the different phase of the cell and the precipitation and the temperature recorded in that period. And of course, if you see the two lines, you could see that the Barnett number of cells in all the phase are always lower, indicating that they are affecting. So fire is even affecting in comparison to the control. And in the long term, here we are talking about 2019, 2020, and we are still monitoring the site. So after a few years, the cambial activity is still suffering from the fire, the experienced fire. We also wanted to compare the crow reduction again with the number of cells, in particular the mature cell, and we verified that when the crow reduction increase, of course, the production of the cell decrease. So it's really related to the crown, so to the canopy. Then we had the possibility to have this tree talker system. I show you some picture. They are these sensors that are quite low cost, and you can put these in each of the trees, on each tree, and you can control several parameters. I show you the parameter, the radial growth, the light, the subflux density, the temperature, the humidity, and stability of each tree. And every 1 hour, the data are transmitted in a cloud and then to us directly on our desktop. So if you have a look to those sites, you can go directly and see the database. So what is going on during the different phase of the period. We started the monitoring in 2020, July. The sensors are there, so we are monitoring since there. And here I just tried to summarize and to show a bit what we are what we found in the subflow, because of course one point is really if the fire is affecting the subflow and in which measure. So in red it's always the barn, in blue is the control site, and you see that in the pointer line indicated the vapor pressure deficit that is very important for our calculation, and at the same time also for the subflow density. And you see that the subflow density of the control, it's always higher, but not during summertime. In summertime, something happens and the control, it's less. So we have a subflow density less than in the Barnett site. So this makes us feeling that maybe we were missing something. We needed to understand if there was some mechanical damage, and we measured, thanks to the colleague in France, the vulnerability of the Barnett branch and towards the control, but we did not find any difference in the cavitation vulnerability of the two different sites, and also no difference in the other parameters that can show if there was some mechanical damage. Even the anatomy, here there is some, just to show you some parameters like the lumen area of the trachate hydraulic conductivity and the cell wall thickness. So they are not structural modification, but it's really due to the physiological behavior of the plants. From these preliminary study, what we could suggest, of course, is that the fire did not cause a structural alteration of the xylem vessel, not an increase in cavitation vulnerability, but the monitoring of the other parameter of the 3 rings let us suggest, especially of the isotope, that it's really related to stomatal activity. So the plants on the control can keep the stomatal, while the other in the burned site, it seems like they need to compensate the fact that the canopy it's really reduced, and maybe this means that they are trying to open more to assimilate, and this could in the long time leads the plants to the death. Of course, those are a preliminary to show. What I wanted to point here is to show how the different approach can give us a piece of the story, and maybe putting all together, we finally can see and can understand how those plants, because I mean, in the long term, since we can monitor the health of the plants, we can imagine that they will go to the death if we don't do a right management of them. And with this, I hope that I was clear enough. I hope that you can give me some suggestion. Of course, this is Pinus pinaster. It's a typical, it's an conifer species, and this could be species specific. So I want to thank you and all the people involved in this project.
Great, thanks, Giovanna. We've got plenty of time for questions, and we will we'll reconvene at the top of the hour. Sama, at this point, do you have any instructions for the next session, or any questions that have come up in the chat?
I'm looking for questions. I don't see anything yet. We do still have about 2 or 3 minutes before we need to go. So if anybody has questions, feel free to turn on your mic and go ahead and ask them. And if not, I'll wrap us up in just a minute.
Yeah, hearing none for the moment. I was just curious. Do you think that the effect on the canopy has a direct influence on the the properties of the cambium and the wood, or is it an indirect effect because the trees that lost more canopy also got a higher dose of heat?
I guess it's an indirect effect, because we did not, from the beginning, when as soon as after the fire, we did not observe any damage to the cambium. So the cambium was active, and this is still active after a few years, but it seems like they are assimilating less carbon. This for sure, because the canopy, I mean, is reducing, it's with a strong reduction. We did not observe any hydraulic failure. That was the first hypothesis we did, but there is no observation. I did not show you because we are still processing the data, but there were no change in the no structural carbohydrates. So at least in the last few years. So it has been something related really to the capacity of the plants to take carbon and then to convert the carbon. Maybe it's using before to the roots. And this means that they have less and less for the radial growth, because I'm so observing radial growth with the dendron. And but also in a point, there will be not carbon for the roots anymore.
Right. Yeah. What a great set of measurements. Any questions?
No, I think we are all ready to wrap up. Like Matt said, we're going to take a. Oh, sorry, Sharon, are you jumping in with a question?
Yeah,
go.
Gonna have one since we have a couple minutes. Thank you, Giovanna, for presenting today. Yeah. So did I just hear right that you said you didn't see a reduction in non-structural carbohydrates?
No. Yeah.
So,
no reduction.
Okay. And so, but so you think that it's just the So that if that would be in the stored NSEs or well, so but you are seeing a decline in.
Yeah, we have seen a decline.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the decline of the plants, it's obvious, but we also study other plants where, dead, declined plants towards control, normal plants, not of this species, but other species. And we also didn't find any difference in the carbon, in the non-structural carbohydrates, but more an increase in the stomach. It's like the plants open the stomata more. And we believe maybe to compensate because the canopy is so small now. I mean, it's more than 50%, and we started from 20% reduction. In few years, some trees are even 80%. So the reduction of the crown is going on. It's keeping.
In line with some other studies that have shown that there's an increase in photosynthetic efficiency of the remaining foliage after fire, but it might not compensate at the whole plant.
Yeah,
level.
but we did not observe, with isotope at least, we did not observe. Of course, I do not have direct measurement. I only have delta 13C, so to estimate it.
Was water potential lower, or did you measure water potential?
Not myself, a colleague of us, and they did not found the difference, but they only did after the fire. So in 2017, not in the year after. This will be very interesting to do, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Giovanna, and thanks to all the other speakers. Sama, if you could just give us some guidance about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks to the speakers. That was fabulous. This session is going to be available in Huva within a couple weeks of the Congress ending. And up next, we have 2 general sessions, 4 special sessions, and 2 fire circle discussion sessions. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the agenda tab on the left of your screen, click sessions, and click the main session title to join. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, please be sure to select the session titled Advances and Challenges for Indigenous Fire Stewardship. We will also be coming back together in about 20 minutes to continue our discussion. So moderators, you can join me anytime, and we'll be kicking off very shortly. Thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.